Well, thanks everybody for jumping in and joining us again. We're doing these Now What webinars for the foreseeable future, at least every Thursday here at 11 Eastern. Really excited about today's conversation. I feel like I say that every time, but I think one of the things that the chemistry team has been doing a lot of talking about here the last few days is a piece that Andy Crouch put out, and we'll link to this in the email that follows up, just about how every organization is a startup right now. You know, a lot of stuff has changed in the last 3-4 weeks. You're tired of hearing about that, but the Crouch piece talks about how we need to be looking at things from 3 different angles. We need to be approaching this season as a blizzard, which is a short-term event that we just kind of do unsustainable things to work through. We need to be approaching it as a winter, so a more of a seasonal approach for 90 days, 6 months, something like that, where we change the way that we do what we do. So to change the way that we program ministry, all that kind of thing, in order to not just survive, but to thrive in this season. Then the other thing is to kind of approach it as a mini ice age, you know, kind of looking at the long-term ramifications of the season that we're in. And so I don't know about you guys, but I'm convinced that, you know, as church leaders, we're probably not at the phase where we're really thinking long and hard about the mini ice age, those long-term effects. I think a lot of us have kind of weathered the blizzard so far and have gotten to the point where we've made the switch to virtual church and all the changes with that, figuring out live stream technology, getting to the point where, you know, it doesn't crash every other minute. Kind of figuring out those initial care ministries that we need to do to be able to care for our community. And then, you know, surviving Easter, which is still a thing, even if there's a pandemic going on, it's kind of still a big deal in the church world. And so I think, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think we're at a point where it's time for us to kind of say, hey, the blizzard, we've survived it, but now we need to start thinking about what the winter looks like. And so our conversation today is really going to be, how should we be thinking about the next 90 days, next 6 months as church leaders? How should we be programming? How should we be learning from the blizzard season? And how should we be moving forward? And so today, pretty excited to be joined by 3 brilliant men. Scott Ridout is joining us. Scott is currently the president of Converge. So Converge is a network of about 1,500 churches throughout the U.S. and the Caribbean. So he's been president for about 5.5 years now. But before that, he was lead pastor at Sun Valley Community Church in Gilbert, Arizona, and he was there for about 22 years. So Scott, thanks for joining us.
So, privilege. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So Tim Farrant is also joining us. Tim has been in pastoral ministry for about 20 years and served in the West Coast and served in the Midwest. And he's currently the executive pastor at Grace Fellowship Church, which is a 4-campus multi-site church in Columbus, Ohio. They're a client of Chemistry's and really have enjoyed working with them and kind of hearing the stories of what they've been doing. One of the most important things I think we all need to know as a community about Tim is that he's a lifelong University of Michigan fan. And he is forced by God, this is his words, forced by God to live and minister in the shadow of Ohio State University. And so we all have our cross to bear. We will pray for you, Tim. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks. It's a privilege to be here. Love working with you guys.
Yeah. And so last but not least, Tim Nations. Tim is one of our church coaches at Chemistry. Before that, he spent about 15 years ministering throughout North Texas, most recently serving as one of the directors at Leadership Network, where he's worked with some of the most creative and influential churches in the country, figuring out how to connect and innovate. And so really grateful to have Tim on board the Chemistry team. He's going to talk a little bit later about some of what we're doing with digital strategy labs for churches in this season. But before we get to that, why don't we talk a little bit about the blizzard season, if we can, fellas? You know, we talked about how we've kind of survived that, and now we need to make the pivot towards this summer. But before we do that, you know, what are some of the things that you guys have experienced? What are some of the churches in your networks have they shared with you about how they have not just survived but have thrived in this season? And maybe Tim, maybe you can tell us a little bit, because of all of us, you're on the ground in the trenches as an XP. What have you guys learned? How have you guys survived this? And tell us what's going on in Columbus.
Yeah, the first thing is I'm already getting OH comments going on and hate from the Buckeye Nation. I need a little bit of like go blue love coming in somehow. At least it's on my chat screen. So I don't know where the go blue people are out there, but I need a little bit of support already. So, but no, thanks for tossing the ball to me. I don't know about your church, but for us, this wasn't like a blizzard that we saw coming on the 14-day forecast, that we could predict for. We saw this as we have a Thursday night service, and it was that Wednesday that we started hearing that the governor was about to drop in this no mass gathering things. We had a church series that was planned, that was a vision series called like By Design, where we were going to talk about the vision of the church. Nice. And we were all set to go. And then we're watching this news conference on Wednesday, and we're like, we're done. We got to pivot this whole thing. And so not only, I think it's critical for us all to remember, it wasn't just a blizzard. Like it was we're driving along and all of a sudden we're all hit with this surprise blizzard. And so we had to pivot a bunch of stuff really quickly. We also were a church that, for some philosophical and even a little bit strategic reasons, we had kind of held out. And so we didn't do any online streaming of our services. We posted a message at 2:00 on Sunday afternoon, and that was it. So we had to pivot in some huge ways. And a couple things. So that first weekend, we ended up getting some stuff online, doing stuff. Our offering was 60% normal of what our normal offering was. And we were like, guys, we got to figure this out. And so I was so proud of our team, but we huddled up, and there's been a few things that we did where we just started going straight into, we need to start thanking everybody who gives every single week. So we repurposed some of our staff, and we're sending a weekly email with a note from one of our pastors thanking every single person who gives online. We repurposed a bunch of staff. In that first 7 day or 10 days, basically, we called 7,000 people personally in our church to pray with them, to reach out to them, and got back to like the groundwork of just real personal pastoral ministry. And the fruit that came from that, as people were losing their jobs, as they were struggling, like the fruit has been amazing. We now have a volunteer team that's doing that every single week with people. Some other stuff, we realized we had to take our services from what we were considering kind of living room moments where people come to us, and all of a sudden we were all out on everybody's front lawn. And everybody driving by could see what we were doing. And so shifting that mentality has been huge. But and just praise God for this. We haven't gotten it all right, but our team has pivoted great. Since that first week, our offerings have actually been up over 20% more than what our normal offerings were, as we've just engaged people differently. We've been able to tell incredible stories. Our staff has pivoted, and we're just seeing ministry done in personal ways that we haven't in a while. Pushing really hard on spiritual disciplines and things like that within our church. So those are just a few highlights. I know we'll get into some more details, but those are some of the things we did out of the gate.
That's great. That's great. Scott, as you interact with your crowd, I mean, what are you hearing? It sounds like, and Tim has said a little bit of this, it sounds like a lot of what's going on is we're getting back to, the old school pastoring, high touch, going to people, that kind of thing. What are you hearing from your crowd?
Well, initially there's a lot of excitement about, especially for those who like to experiment, who like new things and different things. There's excitement from their side. There's dread on the other side of those who are more about stability and keeping things the same. But what I've seen is collaborations that didn't exist before. I was up in Connecticut when President Trump gave his talk that Wednesday night. And by Thursday morning, that church, which was a larger church, had already called all the church plants in our movement in the area and said, listen, we know you're going to have to go digital. You can come and use our building, and you can video all your stuff for several weeks, get prepared, and then scheduled time for them. So the collaborative spirit was pretty exciting to see. I've also No, I have a friend who told me that we had 27% of churches in America that were online streaming before this thing happened. We're up to about 90% of churches that have a presence,
Wow.
digital presence now, which means 10% still don't. I can name some of those churches in our movement. They're all rural and old school, and their motto is "We shall not be moved." So it's we're seeing a lot more buy-in, a lot more recognition. This is a longer term thing, but initially it was the frantic, scattering of how are we going to do this and solving the questions of the moment. But that's over. All of a sudden, it's not the blizzard anymore. There's more going on, and so we're seeing some more tensions.
Mm. That's good. So as you guys are seeing this, I mean, what from our blizzard strategies do we need to take into this next season, or is there anything? Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
I think the silence on that, may speak to your, to the answer is that, because the blizzard is just about survival, people have got that down. And what I'm hearing from churches is, they've got some things out there. They did some things in a pinch to keep some sense of normalcy and to take care of some of the basics of, being church. And they're continuing to refine that as they go along. And so I think most churches, that's really all that needs to be done is they just need to keep the feedback loop open. They need to get feedback from their members, see how they can, just continue to tweak those little things. But the main shift really needs to be on the seasonal approach, the longer term approach. How can we take our energy and our effort and our focus and really put it into a longer term approach? And I'll share one of the bits of anxiety and one of the challenges that I'm hearing from leaders and trying to do that is the uncertainty of it all. How long is this going to last? And if we put a lot of energy and focus into creating a strategy that either the quarantine period lasts much longer than that strategy or it's much shorter, how do we do that? And I think leaders need to approach planning for the months ahead with some different scenarios in mind. And so, unlike in the future or in the past where we could say, okay, here's kind of our 6-month strategy, or at least we used to think we could have a 6-month strategy. And you had a very solid timeline to be able to implement things. You need to think about different scenarios within that time frame, come up with a strategy, but also come up with some contingency plans. So, if we can start meeting in a phased approach sooner than we think, how does that change the plans? If it's going to be a lot longer than we think, how do we continue to plan and to pivot into the future? And so, just from what I'm hearing, that's one of the things I think will be helpful for leaders as they're thinking about new ideas for the months ahead.
Mm.
Yeah, one of the big questions we're asking is not so much, and now that we're past a little the blizzard, and Tim, you're mentioning this a little bit, is not so much what do we need to do to survive, but now at this point we're asking the question, what does it look like for us to have won on the other side of it? So really praying through, God, what are you doing around us? And what does it look like for our church to win on the other side of this winter season? So we're starting to ask the question, come September 1st, what should be true? We're taking this approach. We've prayed as a church, like we've prayed for years for the opportunity to get in everybody's houses, right? To reach everybody in our community. And now people are paying attention in ways that they weren't before, and they have access to our churches in ways that they would never step foot on one of our campuses. And so we're seizing this as like an evangelistic front door opportunity. And we have some goals that when we do get to open back up, a win for us is how many new people have we connected with and connected to that now are ready to begin their spiritual journeys by starting to come back to a campus. So I don't know what those wins would be, but you've got to stop asking the question of just how are we going to survive in this? And really, God, what is the vision that you have for our church to win? And what does it look like on the other side of it?
Yeah, I really like what Tim is saying. Leaders look at crisis differently. Leaders always look at crisis as opportunity. It's opportunity to assess your leadership to this point. it's like a thermometer, barometer. It tells you how sick or how healthy you are. It doesn't change you, but it tells you where you're at in your leadership. In this particular scenario, I would just tell you that right now, gratefulness is our greatest tool. We've got to have an attitude that matches our belief in who God is and what he can do through us. I mean, think about it. Easter weekend, I'm pretty sure more people around the world heard the gospel than any other day in the history of the world because of the digital age that we're in. And there's all sorts of churches that are taking advantage of that. And so I know churches that have started to say, okay, let's do Alpha online, and let's try other outreaches online, and let's just take this digital audience that we have. Well, we saw in our movement, we saw record numbers of views. We had one church that's very, very large, and they had about 200,000 people viewing this weekend. Now, they only saw about 600 people come to Christ. And so evangelism is a whole different story. Digital evangelism is an opportunity for us to figure out. But the exposure piece of it was very, very positive. And so we got to figure those things out. I've been telling churches, I'm Baptistic, so I've got 3 Ds. It's digital. We got to figure out the digital world. We got to figure out daily. Spiritual formation doesn't happen in a day, but it does happen daily. And so what's the daily things we're asking people to do? And then finally, dinner table. How can we win the dinner table conversation? What can we do to actually get families to talk about their faith? And like Tim said, I agree with him 100%. This has been a gift from God. I mean, we've been praying for years that our people would walk with God personally and not have a secondhand faith. We've been praying that they would lead their families well. We've been praying that they would reach out to their neighbors and have concern for their communities, and look what God gave us. And so we've got this great opportunity to be grateful and to take that as leaders and remind people that God is bigger than any circumstance we're in, not just in the moment, but long term, and hopefully turn people's hearts toward God in the situation.
Very good. Hey, Tim, we've got a question, Tim Farrant. We've got a question for you that came in. And this kind of goes back to what you were saying originally, and we had written this, I think, in a blog post 3 or 4 weeks ago, that the tendency we're seeing in a lot of church staff particularly is they're either leaning in or they're zoning out. And it sounds like you guys have totally leaned in, which I think is awesome. This question is both about staff and about volunteers and about that whole pivot and leaning in. This question comes in from Werner. He said, you've talked about personally calling 7,000 people. How did you mobilize? I would assume that staff probably and a bunch of volunteers making those calls. How did you do that? What did you set that up to be like? What questions were you asking? What guidelines did you give them? That's my first question. The second question is, as you made that pivot, were there some people? Did you find that some people were leaning totally in, and did you have anybody that zoned out, or is it so much a part of Grace's DNA that everybody was just instantly, man, we're in, let's do it?
Yeah, we're probably an all-in kind of a church and staff. So, the truth is, if you're not that makeup, you probably don't want to be part of our staff. So,
honestly, that's one of the things we hear from a few churches we've heard from that are saying, help us make this pivot, because we have staff that are actually really pushing back kind of hard on, we either don't know what to do, or we don't know how to do it, or this is just, it's not my job description. Right. So,
yeah. And maybe it goes a little bit back to, I'll answer the one question that's functional, but maybe it goes a little bit back to, have you as the lead guy or lead pastor or leader of the team, have you defined what your wins are for this season? Because if you haven't put a target on the wall, if you haven't cast a vision for what the wins are, your staff doesn't know what to rally around. Yeah. So when we laid out a few of the goals that we're going to have in much shorter bursts than we used to what Tim Nations was saying earlier, I mean, you got to shorten these windows down a lot now. But with that, and then we repurposed our staff and, told them where to shoot and align together and then celebrate the wins on the other side of it. So I think there's got to be clarity with that. But I'll answer the question about the volunteers real quick. This was so good. Because we were pretty hesitant when we first pivoted, thinking the staff needed to do a bunch of stuff. And I don't even remember who said it on our staff, but one of our leaders in a conversation was like, you know what the truth is? We have like over 1,000 people every single weekend that come and serve and volunteer in some way. that aren't able to anymore. But the truth is they believe in the gospel. They believe in the mission of our church, and they still want to help us move it forward. They just don't know how to. And they're sitting around at home thinking they can't do anything.
Yeah.
And so instead of them, leading the 4th grade girls small group, in the children's ministry, let's get them calling all those families. Instead of investing the time to, hold a door or make coffee, like let's get them involved in other ways, so we're put together, like whether it's an online engagement team. I mean, we've got like super fans that we're asking to share content out, to comment on things, everything to that we have hundreds of people that are making phone calls every single week. And the fruit of that, as they are connecting with these new people on their campuses, already has been incredible as they're praying with people. So I would just say, you've got an army of volunteers from your church that are sitting at home going, I don't know what to do anymore because I can't do what I used to do. So look at some ways to engage them around some of the goals and vision that you have.
Yeah, Tim, I think you really hit something on the head there that I think as I'm talking with churches and listening to them, that's going to really a key success factor for churches making the shift to a winter strategy, is thinking through how can we equip and redeploy people in order to meet the needs both inside the church and in our community. And I think what you guys are doing is right on, because I'm seeing churches that are one, for example, had a conversation with a leader and they were worried about, we've got all these folks who have been visiting with us for a few weeks prior to all of this, but they're not members, they're not plugged in, they don't have a small group. And so they took all their greeters, the folks that love connecting with and talking with people that are new and helping them feel welcome and comfortable. They took them and gave them numbers and had them follow up with people. And so that engagement, that just that effort of saying, hey, we know you're still there. You're not a member, but you were on a journey with us and we care about that. And using their own people to do that, they've created some relationships within the church there that those people are going to remember and that are going to make a difference in their lives. And so, but I want to go back to what you said about, the new scorecard, about figuring out, what is it we're going to measure? What are our goals during this time? Can you share some of the specific metrics that you're using now that are different from before?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the ones like, and I'll share kind of principles, not necessarily our numbers, because, those could be different depending on your church size. But there's some things that we're engaging right now, like with the number of our grace, we call them grace groups, home groups, life groups, whatever it is. We right out of the gate said, we got to have 95% of them transition to online, right? So you got to have a new win around that. We're putting percentages like 90% of them right now. We want to finish the group season well. So we're monitoring the attendance, to make sure that there's still traction in that. Obviously there's some financial goals. There's new people. We have a numeric goal that's pretty aggressive, that at the end of this winter season, we're hoping new people who connect to our church who have never stepped foot on our campus before. Because again, we're leaning all in. Like, we're not just in survival mode. We've always said we're going to marry our mission and date our model, and we're putting our money to our mouth where our mouth is right now. Like, let's go. Let's come up with a different model to increase the mission. So we've got some goals around that. We have our children's ministry and has separate goals around how they're engaging families differently, and they're tracking that during this season, to the personal phone calls that we're making to people, to our benevolence. What are we doing to help people? That's all shifted. And so there's new goals associated with the number of families we're going to help. Just those types. Is that kind of what you're looking for, Tim?
Yeah, I think it's helpful for people to hear specifics sometimes, because, when you get it to a point where you're really not sure, I loved one of the things that was said in last week's webinar. It was, and this was in the context of finances, but now is the time to think about church in a way we should normally be thinking about church. And I think the reality is, it's hard for us when we think about in-person attendance, and a lot of the ways we think about church has to do with the location, it's hard for some of us to make the shift to, well, what should I be measuring now? And I think just hearing some of the very specific practical things gives leaders ideas and things that they can apply to their own situation.
Yeah, no, I think that's really smart. Scott, I want to kind of move this discussion over and ask you. So you're working. So Tim said, we made 7,000 phone calls. So most churches aren't going to be able to make 7,000. I live in a town of 8,000 people, so that would be like calling everybody, which would be kind of cool. Scott, you work with large churches. You work with small churches too. What are you seeing as far? And this is a question we had from Jim. He says, great stuff, but what about the church that has one staff pastor and 80 people? I mean, so how are you seeing this pivot from the blizzard into the season? How are you seeing that pivot happen in maybe some smaller to mid-sized churches?
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of positive things happening in those churches. They're seeing themselves and their call not to the congregation, but to the community. And so they're going way beyond those in the congregation, and they're seeing the community. One of the perspectives that we have is that if you have a medical worker in your church, if you have someone who works in a drive-through restaurant that's still open, you realize those are the missionaries of the moment, right? And that we should be praying for them as a church. We should be empowering them, encouraging them, taking care of them. Every church has elderly in their community. And so what's the plan to create a shopping team for those who can't go out and shop, do other things. I would also say that, the younger generation has to be deployed in this moment. They're technologically savvy. They're fish in water, whereas the older generation's not. And so there's a great opportunity to empower them to say, how would we do this? If you don't know what the word TikTok means, you've never been very savvy, then I want to just tell you, you need to figure out that younger generation and how they can help you. I know one church that had a junior high pastor that took the entire team through how to use some social media things right as this began, because the entire team didn't know how to use different things. And so they did tutorials. We're seeing Sunday school teachers that are going online and having a 7 p.m. on Wednesday Sunday school class. They're teachers, they're master teachers, know the scripture, and just inviting everyone in the church to do that. What I'm seeing in pastors is what I call decision fatigue. Pastors have been through the crisis, and they have thought, it's all up to me because I'm the paid professional. And what Tim said was brilliant. It doesn't matter what size church you have. You've got a decentralized ministry. You've got a decentralized decision making. You've got to empower everyone to be the church. The church is not a building we sit in. It's a movement we choose to be a part of. So let's be the church. So we've got a decentralized ministry. We also have to centralize messaging as a church. What I'm seeing is overload of messages from every department, from every person, from giving instruction. And you got to centralize that messaging. And the messaging has to be clear, and it has to be calm, and it has to be compelling to move people toward what needs to happen. This is what it means to move forward as the church. The last thing I'll say is this. I've run into a whole bunch of pastors who are online for the first time, and they're watching themselves online for the first time, and they just get this cringe factor about themselves because they're not Craig Rochelle or Andy Stanley or Steve Furtick. Or I had one pastor, I was a small church pastor I was talking to, and he said he got so upset that after he finished preaching, he ran for 5 miles, and he got off his bike, and he got off on his bike and rode for another 50 afterwards. He was so upset with himself. And I just reminded him and said, you've been the pastor of that church for several years now. Craig's great. Andy's super. Steve's out of this world in their preaching style. But you realize there's nobody in the world your congregation would rather hear from than you in this moment. That God has placed you as the leader of this congregation. And so, listen, be faithful to the word, give them encouragement and hope, make Christ central, make sure they have vision and values of the church on display, and give everyone a step to take this week, and you'll be preaching great. Doesn't matter what's behind you and what lights and whatever you have. I mean, just be yourself. God's called you to this community, and move forward in that.
That's great, Scott. So be you is what you're saying. Let me circle back to something you were saying about decentralizing, Scott. So one of the questions that we'll get in the conversations, whether it's people asking, Tim this, or, pastors that are talking to Tim Nations or myself, we talk about decentralizing and pushing ministry out to people, but how do we do that in a way that we can be confident that it's done right? I think one of the ways that this question gets asked is, what kind of guidelines and orientation do you give people? But how do we do this and know that it's not going to go sideways?
Well, I mean, it depends on the pastor knows the church better than anybody. And I would just say that there's, in times of crisis, being helpful is the best thing. You don't have to have none of us know what's going to happen 5 months from now. We don't know. We're all guessing, and we're all hoping that what we're doing is a good guess. But I would just say this, in crisis, clarity is king. And so you've got to be clear. Here's the few things that matter. Give them the principles. There are a lot of people that need to be prescriptive as well, saying, here's a few things you could do. Give them a short list of things they could do. Hey, drop a note on your neighbor's door. My son is in Omaha. He had to fire his entire team. He's 25 years old. I mean, the pressure of that is intense for a 25-year-old. And he said, Dad, what do I do? And I said, you just need to know that Amazon, you want these employees back, right? I said, yeah. So I said, Amazon's your best friend right now. And one of them was having a baby. And so he bought them some formula and just sent it through Amazon. He can't talk to him. He can't be with it. So he sent, I'm just going to tell you, the church can be creative. Send things to your neighbors, send things to people. Be generous during this time. Show the generosity. Amazon is our best friend when it comes to generosity. So figure out ways to bless families and to encourage your community. Make sure you're encouraging to the leadership, but you don't have to have that's a principle. You don't have to have all the practices in place, but just know that generosity wins the day. And people are looking for hope, and they're looking for connection. Here's a simple thing: that if you're a small church pastor, with your spouse, just make a decision about going through the congregational list and have a video chat. Just schedule 10 video chats a week with different people in the church, and just walk through and just, hey, let's do a 1 hour check-in and just sit there and talk and pray. And if you're a large church, it's a span of care conversation, making sure that the span of care is sustainable for the person, and it reaches everybody who's in groups or not in groups. And just, what's your span of care strategy?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. One of the best things, guys, that I've heard, I think this comes from Dave Travis. He probably got it from somebody else. No, Dave, he probably thought it up. He's got a pretty good head. Is this whole shift that churches have to make between going what used to be the platform to the pastoral, moving from the platform to the pastoral. And I hear you talking about that, Scott. So many of our churches are based on everybody comes in and sees what's happening on the platform. So many of our staff have their roles around preparing for what goes on the platform. And now that platform's gone, right? So we have to go to more pastoral stuff. Kind of what we were saying earlier in the webinar is that it really kind of goes back to what we probably should have been doing a lot more of in the first place anyway. I want to circle back to Werner asked another question. And then Jim also had a great comment in the comments section to us here. Werner asks Tim Farrant, so what parameters what was the charge that you used for your staff and your volunteers? What did you ask? How did you set up those 7,000 conversations? And then also for both Tim and Scott, I'd love to hear, Jim wrote in and said, unleashing people for ministry means I have to be willing to cringe sometimes and even watch them fail. And that's really hard for church leaders to kind of give up some of that platform control to volunteers and other staff and sometimes watch that fail. Tim, could you talk about the criteria you used for those, how you set up those 7,000 calls? And then both of you, if you could talk about maybe how you deal with kind of letting go and even when you sometimes have to cringe.
Yeah, I think I'll share from our experience, but I do think it's scalable no matter what your church size is. So what we're trying to identify is every single week, we call them our big rocks. So there's one or two that is the focus of our church that we're asking people to focus in on. So obviously last week was invite some people to Easter, right? And here's the means in which you can do that and the way that we're going to be doing that. This next week is for us. For this week was a whole focus around a new reading plan to get them in their personal spiritual disciplines, as well as some online Bible studies that we started. And so the framework around that for those calls is, number one, it's a check-in, right? That's the primary goal. How are you? How are you doing? How can I pray for you? We pray for them before we get off the phone with them, or even via text. If we're texting back and forth, it's, hey, I'm going to pause and pray for you right now. But then the other side is, we're saying, here's the one thing we'd love for you to make sure you pay attention to in the life of our church this week. Not 7 things, not 14, but just one thing. And so for this week, it's, hey, have you signed up for our devotional reading plan that we're starting? Because, the personal spiritual disciplines is a key part of what you can grow in this season. And if you're not in any type of community, join one of our groups that go along with that. And so that's the structure. So each week they're getting an email that has those things laid out for them. And so again, I think that's scalable no matter what. Even if you're a really small church and you want to have 3 or 4 or 5 people, pull those people together as a team and say, you guys used to be a core team. I love what Tim Nation said about that. You used to be our best greeters. Well, I'm going to give you a chance to greet a whole bunch of people. Here's a list of 10 people that I want you to greet every single week. And I'm going to send you some talking points and to encourage them and, and take a different innovative approach with the right group of people. So anyway, that's the scoop.
It's really good, Tim. I agree with you. I think everything you're doing is scalable, and it's not about the size of the church. It's really about, I talked about centralized messaging. That's what you're doing. Here's the one thing we want you to do this week. That's the vision and values on display. And it's also individuals taking a step, to address the cringe thing. People are responding to this crisis in 3 ways. They're responding practically, what do we need to do right now? They're responding futuristically, what does it look like in the future? And this is part of this conversation. And they're responding theologically. So I just want to give a theological answer to your cringe factor issue. And it's this: it's not my church. It's not your church. It's God's church. These are God's people. And we have to have a theology of stewardship when it comes to the church. The earth is the Lord's and everything it contains, the whole world and all who live in it. The same Holy Spirit that lives in the pastor lives in that person in the church as well. The Holy Spirit will give them wisdom. Now, we need to give them some instruction, remind them. And Jesus gave the disciples instruction in Matthew chapter 10 when they went out 2 by 2. Gave them some instruction, but the Holy Spirit led them. And so it's a good mix of simple instruction, a calm spirit, and reminding them of the Holy Spirit's power in their lives to give them wisdom as they're discerning those things they should do. So I don't know about you, but I've had plenty of people in my church that did cringeworthy things outside of crisis. So, but the church survived. In fact, the church thrived. So I'm okay with that. We're not in control. God is in control. Our job is to empower the people to be the church in this season.
That's good, guys. Appreciate you guys sharing that. Yeah, one of the things that Matt mentioned at the beginning was kind of the third part of this article, this conversation, having to do with the Ice Age, and to bring that into the context of church, really talking about the relaunch. So once we get out of this winter season, however long that may be, there's a relaunch that's going to take place, and beginning to think about how to manage that and how things are going to look different for the future once that relaunch happens. That's one of the things that we'll be talking about in the strategy labs that Matt mentioned. But before I talk a little bit about that opportunity, I'd love to hear from you two guys about a couple of suggestions that you would make to church leaders as they begin thinking about the relaunch. What are some things that they need to keep in mind? Maybe what are some of the questions that you guys are answering as you answer, you try to figure that out for yourselves?
Well, I know that it looks like if you saw the Harvard University article yesterday, they're predicting that this will be on and off for the next couple of years. And so there may be other times in the future where we'll have stay at home or shelter in place kind of things based on how this thing, when you flatten the curve of a pandemic, it extends the curve. And so it's going to be longer and less predictable. I mean, the first thing you need to have some people thinking about the future. You need to have some people looking ahead, looking 3 months ahead, 6 months ahead. And so who are the futuristic people who are also practical and leadership in your church? Well, it doesn't matter what size your church is. Who are the people who are going to be thinking long-term and thinking midterm instead of thinking about the next few weeks, the next month or so? So have a team, a COVID response team or a long-term team. It could be your elders, it could be staff people, it could be business people in your congregation who have a futuristic mindset and are really good at seeing the future. So make sure you have those things in place. I would tell you there's going to be a cascading effect. We'll probably go to 10 people at a time, and then 25 people at a time, and then 50, then 100. It's not going to be an all of a sudden, hey guys, let's go out and party. Let's go out and go back to the stadiums. It's just not going to be that way. And so you as a church have to decide the ability to stay, do we want to do things in small groups? Do we want to stay online for a period of time? I know lots of large churches are saying, no, it's go big or go home. We think we can actually sustain this for a long time and not meet as a group until we get to a certain size, 250 or more, where it makes sense to open up our facility. So again, every church is going to be different on that, but having a team that thinks about it. And I want to just tell you this, if you're not a part of a network, if you're not a part of a group of people, it's a mistake. Now's the time to become humble and collaborative. And there are people who are ahead of you and there are people behind you. You can help some people and people can help you. Just find this tribe or this niche or this group, whether it's through chemistry staffing, but find this group that you can encourage one another. One of the things I've done in my position is I've got groups of 10 of pastors that I'm creating text threads. And I'm getting these pastors together because they're in the same scenarios. And I'm just texting them and say, hey guys, you all have auditoriums over 1,000, all have auditoriums under 100. What are you going to do? How are you going to handle this? And getting them to talk to each other. And but it's really important to have a collaborative spirit and have a futuristic plan in this season. But no, it's not going to. It's going to be over time. It's not going to all of a sudden we're open and everything's going to be the same. You just need to know that.
Yeah, and I think, I don't want to go against what you just said, Tim. I think, or Scott, I think there was some good stuff in there. I would want to caution church leaders from getting so obsessed with what comes next that we're not living in what God's trying to do now. And I think depending on your nature, you can start to go, we got to plan for the ice age. We got to plan for the ice age, and go, no, God's trying to do something right now, and be flexible enough to learn from the people that are going to go before us. Like you said, Scott, restaurants are going to open first. There's going to be things that are going to open first, and let's learn from those best practices as they happen. So not to not have a plan at all, but also I want to caution all of us as church leaders to not be so consumed with what's going to happen 6 months from now in the reopen phase that we miss this phase over the next 3 months, that God could do some really unique stuff in us and through us. And so it's a tension, it's both and, but making sure that we're living in that tension well and leading our people well towards it. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great word, Tim. And I think you're exactly right. It's a both and if you're one of the people that is trying to figure out how much energy do I put in which bucket, you definitely want more of your energy right now in the bucket of right now, right? Of what's happening, what God is trying to do. But if you are looking toward that relaunch strategy, I love what Scott said about collaboration and, not walking this alone, finding people that you can bounce ideas off of, learn from one another. This is a great time to do that because everyone's learning at this point, and we can do that together. That's one of the reasons why we're doing these virtual strategy labs, is so we can get people that are asking some of the same questions together to spend 6 weeks bouncing ideas off of one another, learning for one another, figuring out what are some next steps that we need to do to maximize what's happening now and what God is doing, but also how can we gain some tools for in the future as we are faced with new challenges, new opportunities. How can we make best decisions when those things come up? And so that's a great opportunity for those that would like to take advantage of some of that.
Well, that's great. Thank you guys for taking the time to be here this morning and share with our church leaders. I'm so grateful for the work, Scott, that you're doing with Converge, Tim, that all that you guys are doing in Columbus. Just grateful to know that both of you guys are there. Tim, with the work that you're doing with all the different with all the different churches that you're working with. So thank you guys for taking this time. Really, really grateful. We're going to continue to do this series of webinars over the next several weeks. Next week, Dan Ryland and Mike Bonham will be joining us, and we'll be talking about how to lead with both hope and reality in this season, how to lead your teams that way. And we'll be continuing to, as an organization, Chemistry, we continue to pray for our leaders, but we're also continuing to offer tuition-free, tuition optional coaching. So what Tim was just describing with the virtual strategy lab, we'll be offering that tuition optional. And you can find more about that on Chemistry site. We'll also be sending out the recording for today's conversation, along with all the links that we mentioned a little bit later today. So thank you guys for joining us. Grateful for all that you're up to, and we're thankful for your willingness to share with our churches. Thanks, guys.